Looks like we're taking a deep dive into the world of Robert Boyle today. And wow, you weren't kidding about a stack of material.
Yeah, well, I thought we could use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our main guide through it all.
Perfect.
But
Seems like a good starting point for sure.
it looks like we're dealing with someone who was, not just a scientist, but also a pretty serious philosopher.
Yeah, a real thinker
Yeah.
about faith and reason and, how those two can work together or not.
Right. And that's a topic that's definitely still relevant,
Yeah.
even centuries later.
Oh, absolutely. So where should we start for someone who wants to get to know Boyle, the philosopher Boyle?
Well, we can't totally skip over the biography,
Eh,
even if we're focusing on the more philosophical side of him, because Boyle's life experiences, especially his early ones, they really shaped his whole outlook.
Yeah, born in 1627, the 14th child.
The 14th
Like, can
child.
you imagine?
Talk about sibling rivalry.
Right.
But even beyond that, Boyle had all these near-death experiences when he was young.
Oh, yeah, and he really saw them as proof of divine providence, didn't he?
He did, and that belief, that really stayed with him his entire life.
It makes you wonder if, maybe facing death at such a young age kind of pushed him toward these bigger questions about existence, purpose, God, all of that.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair connection to make.
I would be thinking about those things too, probably.
Yeah, it seems like those brushes with death, it kind of intensified his search for meaning.
Yeah.
He wasn't content with just blind faith or accepting things, just at face value.
Right.
He really wanted to examine things and question and try to really understand the why behind it all.
And that questioning, that took him on some pretty interesting adventures, literally. He went on a huge tour of Europe as a teenager, kind of like a 17th century study abroad, and had some pretty formative encounters.
Oh, yeah, like his encounter in Italy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he describes this encounter with let's say, some friars, whose behavior was a little scandalous, even for the time.
Not exactly what you expect on a, religious pilgrimage.
Right, not exactly, but it seems like it really solidified his distaste for hypocrisy and this kind of, unexamined faith. I mean,
Yeah.
he saw religious divisions all around him, and he really started to believe that true faith, it had to be rooted in reason and evidence.
Not just blind acceptance.
Not just blind acceptance, exactly.
So this is where we start to see the philosopher in him emerge, right?
Right.
He's not rejecting religion outright, but he's saying, hey, I need a little more. I need something that's intellectually satisfying.
Exactly. He was so critical of people who were just, Christian by birth
Yeah.
or because of social pressure. That was not enough for him.
Right.
Boyle wanted a faith that could withstand scrutiny, something that made sense alongside reason and empirical observation.
Okay, so we see him kind of move, from a young man focused on ethics and theology to this dedicated experimental philosopher.
Yeah, and it's a pretty fascinating transformation.
Yeah, so what sparked that shift?
Well, it seems like a combination of factors, but a real turning point was, this is going to sound strange, but his fascination with a furnace?
A furnace.
A furnace, yeah. He was totally captivated by how it worked, the way it transformed materials through heat and chemical reactions.
Huh. It's like the furnace became a microcosm of the universe for him or something.
Right, it was this contained system where he could just observe and experiment, really try to wrap his head around the underlying principles.
You know what they say? Where there's fire, there's a philosopher with a notebook.
Exactly right. It's like it ignited this passion in him for hands-on investigation, this desire to understand the natural world by doing things, observing and experimenting directly.
So we see this move from, abstract theological questions to this more grounded, empirical way of approaching knowledge.
Yeah, and
But how did that play out in his own religious views?
yeah, how did those...
Did he see science and faith as competing forces?
Right, or were they...
Or two sides of the same coin?
That is the question, isn't it? And it's
Yeah.
a question that philosophers are still, grappling with today.
For sure.
But what's so interesting about Boyle is that he didn't shy away from that tension at all. He embraced it.
Right. He wasn't trying to create this, neat little box where science and religion never overlapped or contradicted each other.
Exactly. He saw them as these different ways of knowing, and they both had strengths and weaknesses, limits.
Like, for example, he totally accepted the Genesis creation account, word for word.
He did, even citing Archbishop Ussher's, famous calculation.
Right, 4004 BC.
4004 BC.
Wait, so he took that literally, even as a scientist who was, actively investigating the natural world.
He did, but here's the key.
Okay.
Boyle believed that revelation, as found in Scripture, it provided details that reason and observation just couldn't on their own.
Right. So it was like revelation was filling in the blanks.
Yeah, kind of giving a more complete picture of the
So
universe.
it wasn't a matter of choosing between science and scripture. It was like they were interwoven.
They were totally interwoven.
Each one contributed to a more richer understanding.
And his model of creation really shows this.
Okay.
He believed that God created the world in these stages.
Gotcha.
First matter, then motion, and then finally the laws of nature.
That's a pretty interesting order. What do you think is the significance of that?
I think it suggests that God's power, while obviously immense,
Yeah.
it's not arbitrary.
Okay.
There's a real thoughtfulness to the whole process.
Right. It's not like God just snapped his fingers and everything appeared, fully formed.
Right.
There was this unfolding, this progression.
From the basic building blocks of matter to the forces that make things move to these, elegant laws that govern everything.
Right. So this raises a question for me. Did Boyle think that those laws were like absolute unchanging?
Okay.
Or could God, intervene, suspend them, or even create different laws somewhere else in the universe?
Now that's where things get really interesting. Because Boyle was, a huge champion of the scientific method.
Right.
Like, let's find natural explanations for things.
Right.
But he was also a very devout Christian who definitely believed in miracles. So how did he reconcile those two things?
Right. Yeah. How did he do that?
Well, he said again and again that God was this free establisher of these laws, but he was pretty quiet about how did that divine action actually work within the framework of the laws?
So there's this element of mystery there, like acknowledging the limits of human understanding. Like you can't fully grasp how God works.
Right.
It's almost like he's saying, look, there are some things we just don't know and maybe we never will.
Exactly. And this is where his intellectual humility really shines through, I think.
Yeah.
This guy was brilliant, no doubt, but he wasn't arrogant.
Right.
He totally recognized that there were depths of knowledge that we just couldn't comprehend.
Kind of refreshing, honestly, especially today when it feels like everyone's an expert, or at least they act like it, and everybody's so certain about everything.
Totally.
And this humility, it also extended to his scientific work, too.
Right.
So what we know is Boyle's law, which is, the inverse relationship between the pressure and volume of a gas.
Right.
He didn't present that as some universal, truth.
He was very specific about the fact that his findings applied to atmospheric air within the very specific limits of his experiments.
Right. So he was cautious about making these sweeping claims about everything.
Absolutely, because he understood that nature's complex, way more complex than any one experiment could reveal.
Which brings us to, I think, another really important part of Boyle's philosophy,
Okay.
which is this emphasis on the importance of experimentation.
Yes. I mean, he was a pioneer in developing a systematic approach to scientific inquiry.
Totally. He really believed that observation and experiment, they should guide our theories.
Not the other way around.
Not the other way around, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's look at the world, see what it's doing, and then try to figure out why.
Exactly. And he was big on this idea of, testing and revising our theories constantly in light of new evidence.
Okay, so always being open to being wrong. That's
Right. And also he stressed the value of what he called intermediate causes.
Intermediate causes. What's that all about?
Well, it's this idea that, we don't always have to find the ultimate cause of something to understand how it works.
Okay.
We can focus on the steps in between, the mechanisms that produce an effect,
Right.
even if we don't know where those mechanisms came from, ultimately.
So it's kind of a pragmatic approach. Like, we can still make progress in understanding things,
Right.
even if we don't have all the
But
answers.
if we don't have all the answers exactly.
Even if some questions just stay open.
Right.
Boyle was also very careful to distinguish between, he called them luciferous experiments
Okay.
and fructiferous experiments.
Those are great words.
I know, right?
What do they mean, though?
Yeah, break those down for me. I mean, I get the Lucifer light connection, but
Okay, well, so luciferous experiments, they're designed to illuminate the causes of things.
okay.
Like shine a light on how nature works.
Okay, so they're knowledge-seeking experiments.
Yes, all about understanding,
Right.
just deepening our knowledge.
And maybe not even having any practical application, like just for the sake of knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah, and then you have the fructiferous experiments.
Okay.
And those are all about producing results, tangible benefits for humanity.
So, like, the difference between understanding how gravity works
Right.
and then using that knowledge to build a bridge.
Or a new medicine, exactly.
Okay, so Boyle saw value in both.
He did.
He wasn't one of those guys who was like, oh, applied science, that's not real science.
No, not at all. He believed in science as a way to solve problems and, help people make the world better.
It's interesting how he balances, that rigorous scientific mindset with this, deep sense of wonder
Right.
and even, a belief in the supernatural.
Yeah, that's what makes him so fascinating. He wasn't afraid to hold what seemed like totally contradictory ideas
Right.
to just embrace the mystery of it all.
And that brings us back to his fascination with miracles.
Okay.
So we talked about how he saw science and religion as these two complementary ways of knowing.
Right.
But where do miracles fit in?
Well, for Boyle, miracles weren't just about proving God's existence.
Wow.
They were also about revealing God's character, communicating truths that you couldn't get through reason alone,
Okay.
and, guiding humanity toward a deeper understanding of its place in the universe.
Right. So miracles are this kind of divine communication,
Yeah.
a way for God to break through
Break through the noise, yeah.
and offer us a glimpse of something bigger, something more.
Precisely. And there's this one miracle in particular that he was just drawn to.
Which one?
The miracle of Pentecost.
Okay, the apostles speaking in tongues.
Yes, spreading the gospel to everyone.
So what was it about that miracle that resonated with him so strongly?
Well, it really addressed his concerns about the fragmentation of Christianity.
Yeah, all the different sects and denominations.
Right. This miracle, it seemed to point to a unifying force.
Right, like a divine intervention that went beyond all those differences.
Right, kind of overcoming those divisions and reminding everyone that the core message could bring people together.
Okay, but there's another layer to this too that I think is relevant.
Right.
He was fascinated by this idea of a sudden supernatural infusion of knowledge, right?
Right, this ability to speak languages that you'd never learned,
It's like a direct download of information into the mind.
bypassing all the normal ways of learning.
Totally, and this tied into his belief in the incorporeality of the soul, right? So if the soul is this separate thing, it makes sense that it could be directly influenced by God
Right.
and maybe even do things that we can't explain.
Exactly.
So Pentecost wasn't just some random spectacular event.
Right.
It fit into this bigger framework of his thinking.
About the soul and the power of God and this possibility of knowledge that goes beyond, our normal limits.
Right. Okay, so he was open to miracles,
He was.
but he was more skeptical of claims made by other religions.
He was.
So he dismissed the argument that the Quran itself was a miracle.
Yeah, he did.
Wait, why would he do that?
Because he found the Quran to be stylistically lacking compared to the Bible.
So it wasn't that he was rejecting the possibility of miracles in other religions.
Right.
It was just that he was judging them based on his own criteria.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that makes sense then.
It highlights that even the most open-minded thinkers are still products of their time and their beliefs.
Yeah, that's true for all of us, I guess.
Right.
But even so, Boyle really stands out
Yeah.
for his willingness to, really wrestle with these complex ideas and to acknowledge that sometimes we just don't know.
And to seek this deeper understanding of, the relationship between faith and reason and the natural world.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
He really is a fascinating figure.
Yeah, he is.
Absolutely.
So we left off talking about this idea of, God as the free establisher of these laws of nature. But Boyle not really giving us a lot of detail about the how.
Right, the how, exactly.
Like, how did that divine action actually play out? How does that work?
It's like one of those things that just kind of hangs there,
Yeah.
He brings it up, but then doesn't really go into it.
So are we supposed to take that as like, he's just acknowledging the limits of our understanding?
Yeah, I think so. Like, we can't just figure everything out,
There's some stuff we just don't know.
Some mysteries that stay mysteries.
Okay, so I can buy that.
And I think this is also where you see how important intellectual humility was to him.
Okay, so he wasn't claiming to have all the answers.
Not at all. I mean, this guy was brilliant, a total genius, but not arrogant about it,
Okay, so how does that play out in his actual scientific work?
Well, think about Boyle's law, the whole pressure and volume of a gas thing.
Right, inverse relationship.
Right. He didn't present that as some kind of, universal absolute law.
He was very specific about that, I remember.
He was. He said his findings, they only applied to atmospheric air within the specific conditions of his lab.
Okay, so he's not trying to extrapolate his findings to, like, the whole universe.
No, he's being cautious about making these big, sweeping claims.
Because he understands that nature is so much more complex than any one experiment could show.
Yay, way more complex.
And this kind of leads into another really important part of Boyle's philosophy.
Okay, let's hear it.
This emphasis on experimentation, the hands-on part of it.
Yes, I mean, the guy was a pioneer, really helped to develop a systematic approach to doing science.
So he believed that we have to start with observation and experiment,
Right, that's our foundation.
and then we can build our theories from there.
Not the other way around. We don't start with theories and then just kind of jam the evidence in.
We got to be willing to adjust, to change our mind.
Absolutely, to be wrong sometimes.
And he was really into this idea of what he called intermediate causes.
Yeah, so what are those? Break it down for me.
Okay, so it's this idea that we don't always have to find the ultimate cause of something to understand how it works.
Okay, so we can focus on the steps in between.
Exactly.
The how, not necessarily the ultimate why.
Yeah, so we can look at the mechanisms that produce an effect.
All right, and we can make progress that way even if we don't know, the absolute origin of things.
Okay, so he was also really careful to distinguish between what he called luciferous and fructiferous experiments.
Love those words.
Yeah, great.
Very Boyle. But what do they actually mean?
Okay, so luciferous, like you said, light illumination.
Okay.
So these experiments are about revealing the causes, shining a light on how things actually work.
So it's knowledge for knowledge's sake, that pure curiosity.
That's the joy they have discovered.
Yeah, and then you have fructiferous experiments.
Okay, those are the ones that bear fruit.
Yeah, they lead to practical applications, benefits for people. So like understanding gravity versus using that understanding to build a bridge.
Or develop a new medicine, yeah.
And Boyle saw value in both.
He wasn't a purist who looked down on applied science.
Not at all. He was a pragmatist,
He believed science could be used to solve problems in the world.
to help people.
Yeah, which is pretty cool.
So what's really striking here is this connection between theory and practice.
It's not an either-or situation.
Not at all.
They inform each other.
They feed into each other. Exactly.
Okay, so Boyle's legacy as a philosopher of science.
Oh, what's the takeaway there?
This emphasis on the interconnectedness of theory and practice.
That's a big one for sure.
Like scientific knowledge should be grounded in real-world observations.
Right. Get out there, get your hands dirty, do the experiments.
But we can't stop there. We also have to think about how we can apply that knowledge to solve problems.
And to just keep pushing our understanding further, it's a never-ending process.
Right, so he was a big believer in the power of science to make a difference.
Oh, yeah. He really thought science could change the world.
Which is interesting because, he was also a very spiritual person.
That's the thing about Boyle, right? He was this amazing blend of scientist and spiritual seeker.
And he didn't see those two things as being in conflict.
No, he thought they could work together, complement each other.
Which is, I think, a really important message, especially today.
Especially today, yeah, when everything feels so divided.
Yeah, like it's either science or religion.
Right, you have to choose.
But Boyle shows us that there's another way
A more integrated approach
where we can acknowledge the value of both faith and reason.
without having to pick sides.
And that the pursuit of knowledge, it's a journey.
A journey, not a destination.
Right. And there are always going to be mysteries.
Things we can't explain.
Questions that don't have easy answers. Maybe not any answers.
But that's what makes it so exciting.
Right, the not knowing.
The constant exploration, the
Yeah.
search for truth.
So Boyle, the philosopher-scientist,
What a legacy he left us.
yeah, he really gave us a lot to think about.
Lot to chew on.
About the nature of knowledge, the relationship between faith and reason, the power of science, all of it.
Big questions.
Big questions. And maybe the most important thing he taught us
Yeah.
is that we need to approach those questions with humility,
Right. Not get too big for our britches.
with curiosity,
Always wanting to learn more.
and with a sense of wonder.
Because there's so much out there that we don't know.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's a beautiful thing.
It's interesting to think about Boyle and how he had to balance, his scientific mind with his really strong faith in the supernatural.
Right. Yeah.
Like he could have easily gone all in on one side or the other.
Right. He could have fallen into a purely mechanistic view of the universe.
Or like a totally mystical rejection of reason altogether.
Exactly. But he didn't.
Yeah, he walked that tightrope somehow.
And that's, I think, why he's so interesting from a philosophical perspective.
It's like he was saying, hey, the world is way more complex than we could even imagine.
Right. Yeah.
There are things we can understand through science and through our observations.
Okay.
But there are also things that we just might never be able to fully grasp.
The mysteries, right?
Yeah, the mysteries.
And he was okay with that, with not having all the answers.
Which I think is a pretty valuable lesson for anybody who's, interested in philosophy or just thinking deeply about things.
Oh, for sure. Being comfortable with uncertainty, admitting we don't know everything.
Right, exactly. It's about intellectual humility.
Totally. Recognizing that we're always learning, always refining our understanding of things.
And that's reflected in the way Boyle thought about knowledge, too.
Okay, how so?
Well, he didn't think that knowledge was just about, you know, accumulating facts and data.
Okay.
It was about understanding the underlying causes, the why behind the what.
Right, not just describing, but explaining.
Yeah, exactly. He was digging deeper.
He wanted to get to the bottom of things, really get at the heart of how the universe works.
And this is where his distinction between luciferous and fructiferous experiments is so interesting.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Those words are great.
Right. It's such a vivid way to describe these two different but important aims of science.
Okay, so break it down for me one more time. Remind me.
Okay, so luciferous, light, illumination.
Right.
These experiments are about shining a light on the causes of things.
Okay.
They're about pursuing knowledge for its own sake, just to satisfy our curiosity, you know?
That pure, unadulterated curiosity.
Right, and sometimes those discoveries don't even have an immediate practical application.
Right, it's just about
It's
understanding.
just for the joy of knowing.
And then you have the fructiferous ones.
Right, the ones that actually produce some kind of tangible benefit,
These are the ones that are really out there helping people.
making the world a better place. Yeah.
Okay, so like the difference between understanding how gravity works and then using that knowledge to, I don't know, build a safer airplane.
Right, or develop a new medicine or something.
Exactly. And Boyle, he saw the importance of both.
He didn't dismiss the practical side.
No, he was a pragmatist at heart.
He understood that both are essential for making progress, both as individuals and as a society.
So it's not about picking one or the other. It's about recognizing how they work together.
Right, theory and practice, hand in hand.
This is a huge part of his legacy, I think, this emphasis on how interconnected those two are.
Yeah, he was a true believer in the power of science to change things for the better.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important message, especially, today.
When it feels like science is under attack.
Yeah, like people don't trust it anymore, or they think it's somehow opposed to their beliefs.
Right, but Boyle shows us that it doesn't have to be that way.
Right. You can be a scientist and a spiritual person.
Yeah, you don't have to choose. You can embrace both.
And the pursuit of knowledge, it's a journey that never really ends.
There's always going to be more to learn, more to discover,
Or questions to ask.
and maybe even more questions that we haven't even thought to ask yet.
Right, and that's what makes it all so exciting, so worthwhile.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Robert Boyle.
It's been my pleasure. Really fascinating stuff.
To our listeners, we hope this has given you some food for thought.
New ways to think about science and faith and the world around us.
Remember, the journey of discovery doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of ideas.
Until next time.
See you then.